The fog clung to the vineyard rows like wet wool, thick enough that Henry Dalton could barely see the fourth terraced line where German scouts were moving. His spotter whispered the distance, 5-10 yards, maybe 5-20, and added that it was too far, that they should wait for the patrol to come closer. Dalton's finger tightened anyway. On his rifle barrel, just forward of the front sight, a bent finishing nail, soldered to a piece of wire, caught the dim morning light. It looked like debris, like something that had gotten tangled in the weapon during a firefight and never been removed. It wasn't debris. It was the reason 4 German scouts would be dead in the next 3 minutes. The first scout stopped behind a broken trellis, checking sight lines toward American positions 300 yards downslope. He thought he had distance, thought he had fog, thought American snipers couldn't reach past 400 yards because that's what the manual said, and manuals got followed. Dalton positioned the scout's head at the tip of the bent nail in his scope's field of view, accounted for the wind he felt more than calculated, and pressed the trigger during the natural pause between heartbeats. The Springfield cracked. The scout dropped without sound, without movement, just a sudden transition from vertical to horizontal that his companions didn't immediately notice. The second scout moved forward, calling quietly to the first, probably thinking his partner had taken cover. Dalton had already worked the bolt, the brass casing ejecting in a smooth arc that his spotter caught before it could clink against stone. This target stood at 515 yards, slightly uphill, which meant minor adjustment. The nail tip again, fractional hold for elevation. The bullet took almost a full second to arrive, long enough that Dalton had already begun his breathing cycle for the next shot before the second scout collapsed into the fog. The third scout finally understood something was wrong. He crouched behind a vine post, the thick wooden support used for the vineyard's trellis system, believing it provided cover. It concealed him from view, but not from bullets. The Springfield fired 30 .106 rounds that could penetrate far more than weathered wood. Dalton ranged him at 515 yards, made his holdover calculation using the device nobody in command had noticed, and put the round through both the post and the man behind it. The impact sounded different through wood, a sharp crack instead of the wet thump of bullet-meeting flesh, but the result was identical. The fourth scout ran. Smart decision, wrong direction. He broke toward the fog line, making for the thick weather that would obscure him, presenting his back at approximately 520 yards, moving target at maximum range for Dalton's system. He led the scout by 2 mils, positioned his aiming point using the bent nail reference, controlled his breathing, and fired. The scout made it another 3 steps before his legs stopped working. 4 shots, 4 kills, all beyond the range that Army doctrine said was effective, all delivered by a private from rural Oklahoma who had soldered a bent nail to his rifle barrel because watching Germans operate freely at 450 yards had gotten his spotter killed 3 weeks earlier. If you're wondering how an improvised piece of wire and a finishing nail changed the tactical calculus of an entire division, stay with me, because this story goes deeper than 4 dead scouts in a French vineyard. Before you go, hit that like button. This is the kind of forgotten history that algorithms usually bury, and your click helps us keep digging these stories out. Henry Dalton grew up in Comanche County, Oklahoma during the Depression, where his family raised cattle on land that provided more dust than income. His father died in 1936, pneumonia complicated by years of breathing dirt during the Dust Bowl, which meant Henry and his uncle Raymond managed the ranch through his teenage years. They couldn't afford to lose cattle to predators or illness, which meant shooting problems before they became losses, coyotes at distance, sick calves that needed to be put down humanely, fence line repairs that required precision with limited materials. Henry learned to shoot, not for sport, but for survival, with equipment that was functional but never optimal. His uncle's rifle was a Winchester Model 1895 in Arawas, 30-40 Krag, a lever action with iron sights that had been manufactured before World War I and had never been upgraded. The sights were loose, the barrel was worn, and ammunition was expensive enough that every shot represented a calculation about whether the problem was worth the cost. Raymond taught Henry to hold over, to judge where the bullet would go by instinct rather than equipment, because they didn't have money for new sights and couldn't waste rounds on practice. By 17, Henry could hit fence posts at 300 yards, calling his shots before the bullet landed. Adjusting for wind, he felt more than calculated. When the Selective Service letter arrived in April 1943, Henry Dalton reported to Fort Sill for basic training, with a skill set that most recruits didn't possess, the ability to make old equipment perform beyond its specifications. A sergeant watched him shoot during rifle qualification and saw something in the way he judged distance without asking, the way he called wind nobody else noticed, the way he made small adjustments between shots that looked instinctive but were actually precise. 6 weeks later, Henry was at sniper school at Camp Perry, Ohio, learning doctrine, learning the manual, learning that 400 yards was maximum effective range for the Springfield M1903A4, because that's what the chart said. The M1903A4 was manufactured by Remington, a bolt-action rifle chambered in 30-06 Springfield, topped with a Weaver 330C scope that provided 2.5x magnification. The system was accurate, reliable, and limited by doctrine more than ballistics. The rifle could shoot farther than 400 yards. The 30-06 round remained lethal past 1,000 yards, and the mechanical accuracy of the Springfield was proven. The scope could see farther than 400 yards, even at 2.5x magnification. A trained observer could identify targets at 600 yards in good conditions, but the doctrine said stop at 400 yards, because the first round hit probability dropped below 50% past 425 yards, according to the ballistics tables, and Army sniper training emphasized high-probability shots rather than taking chances. Henry questioned it once during training at Camp Perry. He asked why they were stopping at 400 yards when the rifle could clearly shoot farther and the Germans were clearly operating beyond that range. The instructor, a captain who had never been overseas but had taught the course for 2 years, explained that the ballistics were settled science, the doctrine was proven, and privates didn't rewrite manuals. Henry learned to shoot out to 400 yards and learned to let targets beyond that range walk away. He learned, but he didn't agree. Henry Dalton arrived in France in September 1944, attached to the 36th Infantry Division as part of the push toward the Vosges Mountains in eastern France. The 36th, a National Guard division from Texas, had already fought through Italy and southern France, landing at Saint-Tropez in Operation Dragoon in August and advancing rapidly through the Rhone Valley. By late September, they were approaching the Vosges, a mountain range covered in dense pine forests and small villages, defended by German forces who understood that losing the Vosges meant losing the gateway to the Rhine and Germany itself. The terrain was hostile to attackers, steep slopes covered in trees that reduced visibility to 50 yards, seasonal rains that turned trails into mud and made resupply difficult, small ridges and valleys that channeled movement into predictable paths where German artillery waited. The Germans fought with carefully planned defensive positions extending the division's lines across terrain where initiative never rested wholly with either side. Patrols clashed in the forests, firefights that lasted hours followed by tense silence, followed by sudden contact again. Henry Dalton's first week, he watched a German machine gun team set up at 520 yards on a ridgeline overlooking American positions. Through his scope, he could see them clearly, 3 men, 1 feeding ammunition, 1 on the gun, 1 observing. They were positioning the weapon to enfilade a trail that American patrols used regularly. Dalton ranged them, confirmed the distance with his spotter, a corporal from San Antonio named Marcus Chen, and prepared to engage. Chen stopped him. Doctrine says 400 yards maximum effective. That's 500 plus. You'll miss and then give away our position. Dalton watched the machine gun team finish setting up. 30 minutes later, they opened fire on an American patrol, killing 2 soldiers and wounding 4 before the patrol could find cover. October brought more rain and more frustration. German forward observers operated freely at 450 yards, calling artillery strikes that killed Americans daily while remaining beyond the range that doctrine said snipers should engage. German patrols moved confidently at ranges they knew were safe from American rifles. Machine gun teams positioned themselves at 425 yards, just far enough that doctrine said not to shoot, close enough to cut apart American advances. On October 24th, the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment became surrounded in the Vosges, cut off by German forces and trapped in a defensive perimeter with approximately 700 enemy soldiers positioned around them. The battalion held for 6 days, while relief efforts pushed through German defenses. American casualties mounted, many of them caused by German artillery directed by observers who positioned themselves beyond 400 yards, where American snipers couldn't reach them, according to the manual. Marcus Chen, Dalton's spotter, died on October 28th. A German forward observer positioned at 450 yards, clearly visible through Dalton's scope, was directing artillery fire onto American positions. Chen insisted they could see him, but couldn't engage by doctrine. 2 minutes later, a German shell landed directly in their position. Chen took shrapnel through the chest and lasted 4 minutes. His last words were asking Henry Dalton to write his mother and tell her he'd been brave. Dalton wrote the letter that night. Then he started modifying his rifle. The concept was simple in theory, complex in execution. Create a reference point in his field of view that would allow him to judge holdover for extended ranges without calculations, without adjusting scope turrets, without violating the basic principle of keeping the rifle zeroed at 400 yards as doctrine required. The device needed to be small enough that officers wouldn't notice it, durable enough to withstand combat conditions, and precise enough to provide consistent reference across varying distances. He started with wire from a field telephone, the thin steel wire used for communications that was strong, flexible, and available in every supply dump. He fashioned a small bracket that would mount forward of the front sight, positioned to sit in the lower portion of his scope's field of view without obscuring the reticle. Then he took a finishing nail from an ammunition crate, the small nails used to seal wooden boxes, and bent it to a 15-degree angle. The mathematics were rough but workable. At the scope's magnification and the distance from his eye to the nail, every millimeter of vertical difference in the nail's position translated to approximately 50 yards of range adjustment. He soldered the bent nail to the wire bracket using materials from a field repair kit, positioned it on the barrel, and tested the concept. Position the target at the nail tip for 500 yards. Position it at the nail head for 600 yards. Position it at the wire itself for 450 yards. The device wasn't perfect. Wind still required judgment. Elevation changes still required adjustment. But it provided a consistent reference point for holdover that was faster and more reliable than trying to estimate bullet drop mentally. The finished device weighed less than an ounce. It looked like battlefield damage, like a piece of wire that had gotten wrapped around the barrel accidentally and been left there because nobody cared about cosmetics in combat. Perfect camouflage from officers who might ask questions about unauthorized modifications. Dalton test-fired the rifle at a ruined farmhouse using the stone wall as a backstop, walking his shots out to 500 yards, using debris as aiming points. The system worked. Not perfectly. The bent nail method provided an approximation, not a precision measurement, and first-round hits at 500 yards weren't guaranteed. But it improved his hit probability at extended range from near 0 to maybe 40%, which was enough to make targets beyond 400 yards vulnerable. On November 3rd, Henry Dalton took his modified rifle back to the line. The vineyard incident happened on November 9th, early morning, with fog thick enough to provide concealment, but thin enough that Dalton's scope could penetrate it at distance. German scouts had been probing American positions for 3 days, testing defenses, looking for weak points to exploit. They operated in small teams, experienced soldiers who understood terrain and used weather to their advantage. They stayed beyond 400 yards, where doctrine said they were safe. Dalton and his spotter, a replacement from Tennessee who had been with him for less than a week, positioned themselves in a stone outbuilding overlooking the vineyard. The elevation gave them advantage, the stone gave them cover, and the fog gave them concealment. When the 4 German scouts moved into the vineyard rows, Dalton ranged them instinctively, 500 yards minimum, probably closer to 520, and made his decision. The spotter whispered that it was too far. Dalton fired anyway. 4 shots. Approximately 3 minutes from first round to last. The spotter, watching through binoculars, confirmed all 4 targets down. They held position for another hour, watching for German reaction, then displaced before artillery could arrive. By afternoon, 2 other snipers in the 36th Division knew about the bent nail. By morning, 7 knew. By the end of the week, snipers were working on their own rifles with wire from field telephones and nails from ammunition crates. No official documentation existed, no engineering approval, no armorer inspection, just whispered conversations between snipers who were tired of watching Germans operate freely beyond 400 yards. Officers didn't notice or didn't care. The snipers kept their rifles clean, followed orders, made their shots. The nail was small enough, crude enough, that it looked like battlefield debris. Only another sniper would recognize it as a modification, and snipers weren't telling. The effect showed in statistics that a few careful officers started tracking. German patrols that had operated confidently at 450 yards started dying. Forward observers who had felt safe in distant positions started taking fire. Machine gun teams that set up beyond 400 yards found American bullets arriving from ranges they thought were impossible. A lieutenant with the 143rd Infantry Regiment, a former engineer from Massachusetts who understood ballistics, noticed the pattern in early November. He pulled Henry Dalton aside on November 13th. "Your sector. We're getting confirmed kills at 500-plus yards. 3 weeks ago, nobody was shooting past 400. What changed?" Dalton looked at him for a moment, then answered with one word: motivation. The lieutenant pressed further. "Motivation doesn't change ballistics." "Dia." Dalton's response was direct. "Lost a good spotter to artillery that we couldn't stop because doctrine says don't shoot. Doctrine gets men killed." The lieutenant didn't pursue it further, but he started compiling numbers. October 1944. Confirmed sniper kills in the 36th Division totaled 47, with an average engagement range of 327 yards. Kills beyond 400 yards, 3, representing 6.4% of total. German patrol casualties attributed to sniper fire, 23. American casualties from German artillery called by observers, 183. November 1944. Confirmed sniper kills jumped to 89, with an average engagement range of 428 yards. Kills beyond 400 yards, 41, representing 46.1% of total. German patrol casualties attributed to sniper fire, 67. American casualties from German artillery called by observers, 97. The improvement in long-range kills was 640%. Average engagement range increased 101 yards. The numbers told a story that doctrine hadn't anticipated. Snipers equipped with improvised range markers were engaging targets at distances the manual said were ineffective, and they were succeeding at rates that changed tactical calculations. German units started adjusting their behavior. Observers positioned farther back. Patrols stayed below ridge lines. Machine gun teams set up at greater distances. The 36th Division's operational area became more permissive for American movement and less permissive for German observation. A German after-action report from mid-November, captured later during the Colmar pocket operations, noted, beginning approximately 15th of November 1944, our reconnaissance and observation elements began experiencing casualties at ranges where American sniper engagement had not previously occurred. Multiple losses documented beyond 450 meters, all attributed to single rifle shots. Examination of casualties suggests 30 .06 Springfield ammunition, standard American sniper issue, but engagement range exceeds their normal doctrine. Unit commanders are advised to increase standoff distance for forward observers and restrict patrol operations to covered approaches where possible. The bent nail method spread beyond the 36th Division through informal networks. Snipers rotated to other units, carried their modifications with them, shared the technique with others. A sniper from the 3rd Infantry Division saw Dalton's rifle during a joint operation in December and built his own version using a machine screw instead of a nail, achieving similar results. A Marine sniper in the Pacific heard about the technique third hand, experimented with a variation using a small piece of brass welded to his scope mount, and used it effectively at Iwo Jima. In early December, a captain from Army Ordnance investigating reports of unauthorized rifle modifications in the 36th Division approached Henry Dalton with questions. Your confirmed kills in November, 17 total, 11 beyond 450 yards. That's exceptional shooting. Also statistically unlikely. The manual says first-round hit probability drops below 50% past 425 yards with the Springfield. Dalton acknowledged the accuracy of the manual. The captain continued, "So either you're the best sniper in the European theater, or something changed about how you're engaging targets. I've inspected your rifle. There's a piece of wire with a bent nail on the barrel. Explain its purpose." Dalton considered his response carefully. He could claim the wire was debris, but the captain clearly knew better. He could refuse to answer, but that would accomplish nothing. Instead, he explained the system: the wire bracket, the bent nail, the holdover reference points for extended ranges. He detailed the calculations, the test fires, the results. He finished with the numbers. 4 German scouts at 5 and 10 yards, eliminated in 3 minutes, using a device that cost nothing and violated no specific regulation because no regulation addressed improvised range-finding aids. The captain listened without interrupting. When Dalton finished, the officer asked one question: "Does it work consistently?" Dalton answered honestly, "First-round hit probability at 500 yards is approximately 40% under ideal conditions, lower in wind or poor visibility. That's below doctrinal standards, but significantly better than 0%, which is what the manual provides for targets beyond 400 yards. The captain made notes, thanked Dalton for his time, and left. 3 days later, a memo circulated through sniper sections in VI Corps. The memo did not officially authorize the bent nail method. It did not modify doctrine. It did not change the manual. What it did was note that field expedient modifications to individual weapons that improve operational effectiveness without compromising weapon safety are neither prohibited nor encouraged, and fall under the discretion of unit commanders pending review of battlefield results. In bureaucratic language, that meant, if it works and doesn't blow up your rifle, we're not going to stop you, but we're also not going to endorse it officially because that would require rewriting doctrine, which requires admitting the doctrine was wrong. Henry Dalton survived the war. He returned to Oklahoma in 1946, went back to ranching, never discussed his service in detail. He died in 1987, and his obituary in the Lawton Constitution mentioned his Army service without elaboration. His rifle, the Springfield M19903A4, with the bent nail soldered to the wire bracket, was packed with his gear when he was discharged and remained in his closet for 40 years. After his death, his daughter donated it to the 45th Infantry Division Museum in Oklahoma City, where a curator cataloged it as M1903A4 rifle with field modification of unknown purpose, possibly wire damage from combat. The bent nail sat in the museum's storage for 17 years before a veteran visiting the collection recognized what it was. He explained the system to the curator, who updated the catalog entry and moved the rifle to display. Today it sits in a case labeled Field Expedient Modifications World War II, with a placard that explains Henry Dalton's innovation in 3 short paragraphs that capture none of the context, none of the frustration with doctrine that cost lives, none of the 4 German scouts in a foggy vineyard who died because a private from Oklahoma decided that manuals were guidelines rather than limitations. The broader lesson from Dalton's bent nail extends beyond one sniper's modification. It addresses the tension between doctrine and adaptation, between standardized training and individual problem-solving, between what manuals say is possible and what battlefield conditions demand. The U.S. Army in World War II generally emphasized standardization, equipment, training, and tactics designed to work consistently across diverse units and conditions. This approach had advantages: logistical simplicity, predictable performance, ease of training replacements. But it also created rigidity, particularly in specialized roles like sniping, where individual skill and judgment mattered more than conformity. German sniper doctrine, by contrast, emphasized individual initiative and adaptation. German snipers operated with greater independence, received more extensive training in fieldcraft and camouflage, and were encouraged to develop personal techniques that suited their skills and circumstances. This approach produced highly effective individual snipers, but was harder to scale and sustain as the war continued, and experienced personnel were lost. The bent nail represented an American solution that split the difference. Maintain standardized equipment and doctrine for the majority, but allow room for individuals to adapt when battlefield results justified deviation. The Army's implicit acceptance of the modification through the Sixty Corps memo demonstrated institutional flexibility, even if official doctrine remained unchanged. Doctrine served as the baseline, but exceptional circumstances and exceptional individuals could push beyond it when results justified the risk. From a tactical perspective, extending effective sniper range from 400 yards to 500-plus yards changed the calculus of small unit operations in several ways. It reduced safe standoff distance for German observers and patrols, forcing them to position farther back or accept greater risk. It increased the area that a single American sniper could control, improving efficiency of coverage. It created uncertainty for German forces about where American rifle fire could reach, which affected their planning and movement. These effects were modest individually, but accumulated across multiple engagements to shift tactical advantage. The statistical impact, as documented by the lieutenant from the 143rd Infantry Regiment, showed measurable improvement in key metrics. The 640% increase in kills beyond 400 yards represented a significant expansion of sniper effectiveness. The reduction in American casualties from German artillery, from 183 in October to 97 in November, correlated with increased effectiveness against German forward observers, though other factors also contributed to this decline. German patrol casualties attributed to sniper fire nearly tripled, from 23 to 67, indicating broader impact on German reconnaissance and small unit operations. These numbers don't account for indirect effects: German patrols that avoided areas due to sniper threat, artillery missions that weren't called because observers stayed farther back, machine gun positions that were sighted defensively rather than offensively. The cumulative effect of extended sniper range went beyond confirmed kills to influence German decision-making and operational planning. The bent nail method had limitations that Dalton and others who adopted it understood clearly. It was a rough approximation rather than a precision instrument. It required the sniper to estimate range accurately. The nail provided holdover reference, but if the range estimate was wrong, the holdover would be wrong. It didn't account for variables like temperature, humidity, or elevation changes that affected bullet trajectory at extended ranges. It worked best under ideal conditions and degraded in effectiveness as conditions worsened. First-round hit probability at 500 yards remained below 50%, which meant snipers using the method had to accept higher miss rates and adjust their engagement decisions accordingly. Despite these limitations, the bent nail represented a meaningful improvement over having no method at all for engaging targets beyond 400 yards. It transformed impossible shots into improbable shots, and improbable shots into possible shots. For snipers like Henry Dalton, who had watched Germans operate freely at ranges doctrine said were untouchable, that improvement justified the effort and the risk of using an unauthorized modification. The story raises questions about how military organizations balance innovation and standardization, individual initiative, and institutional control. Too much standardization stifles adaptation and prevents solutions like the bent nail from emerging. Too much individual variation creates logistical chaos and training inconsistency. The ideal lies somewhere between establish doctrine as a baseline, train to standard, but create space for experienced practitioners to adapt when circumstances demand it, and results prove the value. Henry Dalton's bent nail killed 4 German scouts at 5-10 yards because doctrine said it was impossible, which meant the Germans believed they were safe, which meant they made decisions based on that belief. The nail didn't make Dalton a better shot. He had the skill before he built the device. What it did was give him a tool that matched his capability, that allowed him to apply his skill at ranges where it mattered tactically. The Germans ignored the possibility of American sniper fire at 5-10 yards because American doctrine said it wouldn't happen. Doctrine became predictability. Predictability became vulnerability. Vulnerability became 4 bodies in a foggy vineyard. The device itself was unremarkable. A bent finishing nail soldered to telephone wire, weighing less than an ounce, looking like debris. But the principle it represented, that manuals describe what is standard, not what is possible, changed how an entire division's snipers engaged targets. By the end of November 1944, enough snipers in the 36th Infantry Division had adopted some variation of the bent nail method that German forces adjusted their tactical planning to account for American sniper fire at ranges previously considered safe. The 36th Division continued operations through the Vosges Mountains into December, helped contain the Colmar Pocket, and eventually pushed into Germany in early 1945. Snipers equipped with bent nail range markers remained active throughout, contributing to the steady attrition of German reconnaissance and observation capabilities. The division's after-action reports don't specifically mention the modification. Such details rarely appeared in official documentation, but the statistics on sniper effectiveness at extended ranges tell the story indirectly. After the war, as the Army compiled lessons learned and updated training doctrine, sniper engagement ranges were quietly extended in official guidance. The M11903A4's maximum effective range in post-war manuals increased to 600 yards, closer to the weapon's actual capability than the conservative 400-yard limit that had prevailed during much of the war. Whether this change was influenced by field modifications like Henry Dalton's bent nail is unclear from available documentation, but the timing suggests that battlefield experience had demonstrated the value of engaging targets at greater distances. Modern sniper doctrine emphasizes flexibility and adaptation, with engagement decisions left to the sniper's judgment based on conditions, target priority, and mission requirements, rather than rigid range limits. Current training teaches snipers to understand their weapon system's capabilities across varying distances and conditions, and to make informed decisions about when extended range shots are justified. In this sense, contemporary approach reflects lessons learned from snipers like Henry Dalton, who understood that doctrine provides guidance but shouldn't prevent tactically sound decisions. The 4 German scouts who died in the vineyard on November 9, 1944, were skilled soldiers conducting necessary reconnaissance in difficult conditions. They followed their training, which told them that American snipers couldn't reach past 400 yards effectively. That training was based on American doctrine, which was public knowledge that German intelligence had documented and disseminated. The scouts positioned themselves at 5-10 yards because their intelligence said that was safe. They were wrong because one American sniper had decided that doctrine was wrong and had built a device to prove it. Their deaths weren't the result of technological superiority. The Springfield M19903A4 was arguably inferior to German sniper rifles in some respects. They weren't the result of better training. German sniper schools were extensive and effective. They were the result of individual adaptation, of one soldier recognizing that the gap between what his equipment could do and what doctrine said he should do was getting men killed, and finding a way to close that gap with improvised materials and rough mathematics. The bent nail that killed 4 scouts at 5-10 yards wasn't a miracle device or a technological breakthrough. It was a piece of wire and a finishing nail that represented the principle that survival often depends on questioning assumptions, that doctrine serves as a starting point rather than an end point, and that sometimes the difference between living and dying is measured in the distance between what the manual says is possible and what desperate necessity makes necessary. Henry Dalton built that device because his spotter died from artillery directed by an observer he could see but couldn't shoot, according to doctrine. Marcus Chen died at 450 yards because 400 yards was the limit. 4 German scouts died at 5-10 yards because Henry Dalton decided limits were negotiable. The story endures not because the modification was sophisticated, it wasn't, but because it captures a fundamental truth about warfare. Innovation often emerges from frustration with systems that don't match reality, and the soldiers who survive are frequently the ones willing to adapt when doctrine fails them. The bent nail worked not because it was perfect, but because it was better than nothing, and in combat. Better than nothing is often the difference between mission success and mission failure, between coming home and being carried home. That wire and nail sit in a museum now, behind glass, with a placard explaining their purpose in sanitized language that removes the context and the cost. But if you understand what they represent, the deaths that prompted their creation, the doctrine that required circumventing, the 4 German scouts who died because doctrine made them predictable, then you understand something important about how wars are actually fought as opposed to how manuals say they should be fought. The bent nail range marker killed 4 scouts at 510 yards, not through superior technology, but through superior adaptation. That lesson remains relevant anywhere. Doctrine meets battlefield reality, and soldiers must decide whether to follow the book or follow their judgment.